The scream came from the stable yard before the sun had fully risen. Elena Whitmore heard it as she stepped down from the carriage, her small case still gripped in one hand. A groom stumbled backward through the open stable doors, blood on his sleeve, his face white with shock. Behind him, a black stallion reared so high his hooves nearly touched the beam above the door. Men shouted. A whip cracked uselessly against the morning air. Nobody dared move closer. Elena set down her case without thinking. She had come to Ormecliff only to ask about a position in the household, a quiet post far from the gossip of her old village. She had not planned to walk toward danger on her very first morning, but something in the way the horse moved, wild yet trembling, desperate yet cornered, pulled her forward before her mind could argue with her feet. "Stop," a deep voice ordered from across the yard. "Get back from him." Elena turned. A tall man in a dark riding coat strode toward the chaos, his jaw tight, his eyes colder than the autumn morning. She did not know yet that this was Duke Alexander Ormecliff, master of the estate, a man the villagers spoke of only in hushed, careful tones. She only knew that his voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed instantly, and that even the stallion's ears flicked toward the sound of it. "Someone bring a rifle," the Duke said, his voice flat, final. "This animal has caused enough harm." The word rifle struck Elena harder than she expected. She looked at the horse again, really looked. Beneath the wildness, beneath the flashing eyes and the sweat darkening his neck, she saw something else. Fear. Pure, cornered fear. The kind that made a creature strike out not from cruelty but from terror. "Wait," she said. Every head in the yard turned toward her. A stranger, dust from the road still on her hem, telling a Duke to wait. "Who are you?" the Duke asked, each word clipped short. "My name is Elena Whitmore. I came about the position advertised in the county paper." She kept her voice low and even, the way she always spoke around frightened animals. "Please, give me a moment with him before anyone does anything they cannot undo. This is not a village fair trick, Miss Whitmore. 3 of my men have been hurt by this horse in as many weeks. He is dangerous." "He is afraid," Elena said. "There is a difference." The Duke's eyes narrowed, studying her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. Around them, the grooms exchanged uncertain glances, none of them eager to argue with their employer, none of them eager to see another person hurt either. "You will step back," the Duke said. "Now." But Elena was already moving, slow, deliberate steps toward the stall where the stallion stood trapped between 2 frightened handlers and a rope pulled too tight around his neck. She did not look at his eyes directly, did not approach in a straight line the way the grooms had. She angled her body sideways, small and unthreatening, and began to hum, quiet and tuneless, the sound she had used since childhood to calm horses on her family's small farm before it was lost. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said again, sharper now, and she heard him start toward her. "Please," she said without turning, "let the men loosen the rope. It is choking him. That is why he fights." There was a pause, the kind that stretches long in moments of danger. Then, to the shock of everyone in the yard, the Duke lifted one hand, a silent command. The nearest groom, trembling, eased the tension on the rope. The stallion's next scream was different, less rage, more relief. Elena kept humming. She let her hand rise slowly, palm open, not reaching for him, simply letting him see it, letting him choose. The horse's ears swiveled toward her, his great chest heaved. For a long, breathless moment, nothing in the yard moved at all. Then the stallion lowered his head, just slightly, and stepped toward her open palm. A groom gasped. Someone else whispered a prayer under their breath. Elena did not move, did not smile, did not dare break the fragile thread stretching between herself and the frightened animal. She simply stood, letting her fingers finally brush against the velvet of his nose, feeling the hot breath from his nostrils against her skin. "Good," she whispered, so quiet it was almost lost in the morning air. "You are safe now. No one here means to harm you." Behind her, the Duke had gone entirely still. He had seen many things in his years managing Ormecliff. He had seen skilled riders, patient trainers, men who claimed to have a gift with horses and failed within the hour. He had never seen anything like this, a stranger walking into the middle of chaos and quieting it with nothing but a soft voice and an open hand. For the first time in longer than he could remember, something other than grief moved through his chest. It felt almost like hope, though he refused to name it that. "Someone fetch water for him," Elena said, still not turning around, still keeping her attention on the stallion's dark eyes. "Not from the trough by the gate. That water has been sitting too long, and it will be warm. Bring it fresh from the well." A groom hurried to obey before anyone thought to question whether a stranger had the right to give orders in the Ormecliff stables. The Duke finally found his voice. "You handle him as though you have known him for years." "I have known horses like him," Elena said, finally glancing back over her shoulder. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, the kind that came from more than simply lost sleep. Frightened ones who were pushed too hard, too fast, by people who mistook fear for stubbornness. "His name is Titan," the Duke said, "and he has broken the arm of one groom and the ribs of another. I do not believe in miracles, Miss Whitmore, and I do not believe a stranger from the road has solved in 5 minutes what my most experienced men could not solve in 5 weeks." "I am not asking you to believe in miracles," Elena said, keeping one hand resting lightly on Titan's neck, as the horse's breathing slowly steadied beside her. "I am asking you not to shoot an animal for being afraid." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft huff of the stallion's breath and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the stable roof. "You came for the position advertised in the paper," the Duke said finally. "The post was for a scullery maid." "Then I suppose I have already failed to secure it properly," Elena said, a small, tired smile touching her lips despite the tension still humming through her body. "Though I would rather work with your horses than your kitchens, if given the choice." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable, his expression giving away nothing of the storm turning behind them. Elena held his gaze, refusing to look away first, refusing to let him see how her hands trembled now that the danger had passed, and the full weight of what she had just done settled into her bones. "Titan has thrown or injured every man who has come near him in a saddle," the Duke said at last. "If I allow you near the stables, you do so at your own risk, and you will answer directly to me, not to my stable master. Is that understood?" Elena blinked, startled by the sudden shift, though she kept her composure. "You are offering me the position." "I am offering you a trial," the Duke corrected, his voice cool again, the brief crack in his armor sealing shut as quickly as it had opened. "Nothing more. If you fail, or if you are hurt, you will leave Ormecliff, and I will not hear another word about it. And if I succeed—" Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "Then perhaps I will have one less reason to fire a rifle in my own stable yard." He turned before she could answer, his boots striking hard against the packed earth as he walked away, leaving her standing beside the calmest the stallion had been in weeks. The grooms around her slowly returned to their tasks, casting curious, wary glances in her direction, unsure what to make of the stranger who had walked in off the road and tamed the beast none of them could touch. Elena let out a slow breath, her hand still resting against Titan's warm neck, feeling his heartbeat begin to steady beneath her palm. She did not know yet what waited for her at Ormecliff, what secrets lived behind the Duke's guarded eyes, or what price this fragile peace between a frightened horse and a frightened household might eventually demand of her. She only knew, standing there in the pale morning light with dust still on her hem and her heart hammering from more than fear, that she had just stepped into something far larger than the quiet, simple life she had come here seeking. Somewhere above the stable roof, the sun finally broke free of the clouds, spilling gold across the yard, across the dark coat of a stallion no one else had dared approach, and across a young woman who had no idea that her steady hands were about to change everything at Ormecliff. Titan pressed his head gently against her shoulder, as if he already understood what she did not yet know herself. Her life here was only just beginning. Later that morning, after the yard had emptied and the other grooms had returned to their usual duties, an older woman approached Elena near the well. She wore an apron dusted with flour and carried the tired but kind look of someone who had worked at Ormecliff longer than most could remember. "You are either very brave or very foolish," the woman said, studying Elena with open curiosity. "I have not seen the master speak so many words to anyone in a very long time, not since before his brother passed." Elena's ears caught on the mention of a brother, but she did not press for details. Strangers did not ask about grief on their first hour in a new place. "I only wanted to help the horse," she said simply. "I did not mean to cause a stir." "Oh, you caused more than a stir, dear," the woman said with a faint, knowing smile. "You caused the whole household to start talking before breakfast was even served." "That has not happened here in years." She introduced herself as Margaret, the housekeeper, and offered to show Elena where she might wash and rest before beginning any real work. As they walked together toward the servants' entrance, Elena glanced back once more at the stables. Titan stood quietly now, watching her go, his earlier fury replaced by something calmer, something almost curious. She wondered, not for the first time that morning, What exactly had happened to make both the horse and the man who owned him so wary of the world around them? Margaret seemed to notice the direction of her gaze. "That horse belonged to the young master's brother," she said quietly, her voice dropping as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Since the accident, no one has been able to go near him without trouble. Some of the staff believe the horse remembers what happened that day. Others think grief simply makes creatures unpredictable, be they man or beast." Elena said nothing, but the words settled deep inside her, a small piece of a larger puzzle she did not yet understand. She thought of the Duke's cold eyes, the tightness in his jaw when he had ordered the rifle brought, the way his voice had cracked just slightly when he called Titan by name. Whatever had happened at Ormecliff before her arrival, it was clear that both the man and the horse were still trapped somewhere in that same terrible morning, unable to move forward, unable to fully let go. By the time Elena reached the small room she would be given for her stay, the sun had climbed fully into the sky, warm and golden over the vast Ormecliff grounds. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands finally steady again, and allowed herself a single, quiet breath. She had come here searching for nothing more than simple, honest work. Instead, she had found a wounded animal, a guarded, grieving Duke, and a household holding its breath around secrets no one dared speak aloud. Elena closed her eyes, picturing Titan's dark gaze meeting hers in that fragile, silent moment in the yard. Whatever waited for her at Ormecliff, she knew now there would be no turning back. A crash echoed through the stable at dawn, loud enough to send birds scattering from the roof. Elena was already awake, already dressed, already halfway across the yard before she realized what had happened. Inside Titan's stall, a wooden bucket lay overturned, water pooling across the straw, and the stallion stood pressed into the far corner, his eyes wide, his sides heaving. "Easy," Elena murmured, slipping through the gate before anyone could stop her. "Easy now. It was only a bucket. Nothing here means you harm." She had not expected fear to strike so suddenly on only the second morning of her trial, but she had learned long ago that healing rarely moved in a straight line. Titan's ears flattened, then slowly relaxed as her voice reached him, steady and familiar even after so short a time. "You spoil him with kindness," a voice said from the stall door. Elena turned to find the Duke watching her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the pale morning light. She had not heard him approach, though she suspected that was exactly how he preferred to move through his own household, silent and unseen until the moment he chose to be noticed. "Kindness is not the same as spoiling," Elena said, keeping her tone even despite the flicker of nerves in her stomach. "He was afraid of a falling bucket. That is not something training away his spirit will fix. It only needs patience." "Patience," the Duke repeated, as though testing the word for weakness. "My stable master used patience for 3 weeks before Titan broke his arm." "Perhaps your stable master's patience was waiting for the horse to change," Elena said. "Mine is different. I am not waiting for him to change. I am simply staying until he no longer needs to be afraid." Something in the Duke's expression shifted, though he masked it quickly behind the same guarded stillness she had already come to recognize. He stepped into the stall, careful and deliberate, and Titan's body tensed immediately at his presence. "He does not trust me," the Duke said quietly, almost to himself. "He has not trusted me since the day my brother died." Elena's breath caught, but she kept her hands steady on Titan's neck, her focus split between the animal and the man standing rigid a few feet away. "You do not have to explain anything to me, Your Grace." "I am not explaining," he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. "I am simply stating a fact you will discover eventually, since you insist on staying near this horse and this household." Elena said nothing, giving him the space to continue or to retreat, as he chose. For a long moment, the only sound in the stall was Titan's slow, steadying breath and the distant call of roosters somewhere across the estate. "My brother rode him the morning of the accident," the Duke finally said. "Titan came back to the stable alone, without a rider, covered in mud and blood that was not his own. No one has been able to ride him since." His jaw tightened further, if that were even possible. "Every time I look at that horse, I see the last morning my brother was alive." Elena's chest ached at the raw grief buried beneath his controlled words. She understood now why he had ordered the rifle brought, why his men spoke of him only in careful whispers, why the entire household seemed to hold its breath around both the Duke and the horse. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "Titan is not the only one still trapped in that morning." The Duke's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and startled, as though no one had dared speak such a thing to him directly in a very long time. For a moment, she feared she had gone too far, overstepped a boundary no servant, however unofficial her position, should cross. But instead of anger, something closer to exhaustion settled into his features. "You speak plainly, Miss Whitmore." "I find plain speaking wastes less time than careful silence," she said. "Though I understand if that is not welcome here." "It is unfamiliar," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him something. "Most people at Ormecliff choose their words around me as though I might shatter at the wrong sentence." "I do not believe you are so fragile as that, Your Grace," Elena said, and for the briefest moment, something almost like the shadow of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing just as quickly. He cleared his throat, straightening, the mask of composed authority sliding back into place. "You have 1 week, Miss Whitmore. If Titan cannot be ridden safely by the end of it, I will have no choice but to reconsider his fate, regardless of how gentle you have made him in his stall." 1 week, Elena repeated, understanding the weight behind the deadline, understanding that it was not truly about the horse alone. "Then I will not waste a single day of it." Over the following days, Elena settled into a rhythm at Ormecliff that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. She rose before the rest of the household, spending long hours in the stable, teaching Titan to trust the touch of a saddle blanket, the sound of buckles, the weight of a bridle resting gently against his ears. Progress came slowly, in small victories rather than grand breakthroughs, but each small victory built upon the last. The other grooms watched her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect, their earlier wariness softening as they saw the stallion's temperament shift day by day. Even Margaret, the housekeeper, began seeking Elena out during quiet moments, sharing small pieces of gossip about the household, careful never to stray too close to the subject of the late young master or the accident that still haunted the estate. The Duke, for his part, found reasons to appear near the stables more often than his duties strictly required. He told himself it was simply to monitor Titan's progress, to ensure the trial period was being handled properly, but even he could not fully believe that excuse by the 4th day, when he found himself lingering at the fence long after any reasonable inspection should have ended. "You watch him differently than you watch the others," Elena observed one afternoon, not looking up from where she knelt, carefully checking Titan's hoof for any injury. "I do not know what you mean," the Duke said, though the stiffness in his voice suggested he understood exactly what she meant. "You watch him the way someone watches a memory they are afraid to lose," Elena said quietly, "not the way someone watches a dangerous animal." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, beyond the stable, beyond the present moment entirely. "My brother wanted to breed Titan, to build a legacy for Ormecliff stables. He had grand plans for this horse, plans I never took seriously enough while he was alive to hear me say so." "Regret is a heavy thing to carry alone," Elena said. "I have carried heavier," the Duke replied, though something in his tone suggested even he was beginning to doubt that claim. By the 5th day, Titan allowed the saddle to rest fully upon his back for the first time, standing still and calm, as Elena tightened the girth with slow, careful movements. The grooms who witnessed it exchanged astonished glances, whispering amongst themselves about the stranger who had done in less than a week what none of them had managed in over a month. Word of the change spread quickly through the household, reaching even the kitchens, where Margaret hummed a satisfied little tune while preparing the evening meal, pleased to see life returning to a household that had felt frozen in mourning for far too long. But not everyone within Ormecliff's walls welcomed the shift with such open hearts. In a study at the far end of the manor, a cousin of the Duke's, a sharp-eyed man named Gerald Ashworth, watched the growing activity in the stable yard from his window with narrowed, calculating eyes. He had come to Ormecliff weeks earlier under the guise of offering condolences and support during the Duke's continued grief, though his true purpose ran far deeper. Tangled in matters of inheritance and old family debts, he preferred to keep quiet. A distracted, healing Duke was far easier to manage than one whose attention had begun to sharpen once again, drawn back to life by a stranger's steady hands and a stubborn horse's slow return to trust. Gerald turned from the window, already composing the first careful steps of a plan meant to ensure that whatever fragile hope was blooming in that stable yard would not be allowed to take root for long. Elena, unaware of the watching eyes and the quiet schemes forming behind the manor's tall windows, focused only on the horse before her and the man standing a careful distance away, his gray eyes softer now than they had been on the morning she first arrived. For the first time since the accident, Titan lowered his head willingly beneath the weight of the saddle, and for the first time in longer than anyone at Ormecliff could remember, the Duke allowed himself the smallest, most fragile flicker of hope. Neither of them yet understood how quickly that fragile hope could be threatened. nor how far someone within their own walls was willing to go to see it crushed before it had the chance to fully bloom. That evening, after the stable had quieted and the last of the grooms had gone in for supper, Elena remained behind, brushing down Titan's coat by lantern light. She liked this hour best, when the estate settled into stillness, and the only sounds were the soft shuffle of hooves and the occasional sigh of wind through the rafters. It reminded her, in small ways, of the farm she had left behind, the one her family had lost when debts grew too large and grief too heavy for her father to carry any further. She had not told anyone at Ormecliff the full truth of why she had come so far from home, why a woman with her skill for horses had been reduced to seeking a position as a scullery maid before fate, or perhaps simple chance, had placed her in the stable yard on the very morning Titan's temper had reached its breaking point. She preferred it that way. Her past felt like a wound still too raw to expose to strangers, however kind some of them, like Margaret, had already proven to be. "You work later than the others," a voice said from the stable entrance, and Elena did not need to turn to know it belonged to the Duke. "Titan sleeps easier when someone stays a while after the brushing," she said, continuing her slow, even strokes along the stallion's flank. "He does not yet trust the quiet." "Nor do I, most nights," the Duke admitted, stepping further into the lantern light, his usual guarded posture softened slightly by the late hour and the private nature of the moment. Elena glanced at him, surprised by the honesty in his tone. "Is that why you find yourself here so often, Your Grace?" Even when the reports on Titan's progress could easily wait until morning? He did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting toward the stallion rather than toward her, as though it were easier to speak truths to the horse than to the woman standing beside him. "This stable was the last place I saw my brother smile," he said finally. "He stood exactly where you are standing now, laughing about some foolish wager he had made with one of the grooms. I did not know, when I walked away that morning, that it would be the last time I heard that laugh." Elena set down the brush, giving him her full attention, though she kept a respectful distance, sensing he needed the space to speak without feeling crowded by sympathy he had not asked for. "You do not have to carry the weight of that morning alone, Your Grace." "I have managed this estate alone for 2 years," he said, a faint, bitter edge creeping into his voice. "Alone is what I know how to do." "Managing an estate and carrying grief are not the same kind of alone," Elena said gently. "One can be done with steady hands. The other, I think, requires more than steady hands alone can offer." The Duke turned to look at her then, something unguarded flickering across his face before he caught himself and looked away again, back toward the safety of the stallion's dark, watchful eyes. "You speak as though you understand grief intimately, Miss Whitmore." "I understand loss," Elena said simply. "My family lost our farm 3 years ago. My father did not survive the winter that followed. I understand what it means to walk through rooms that used to hold laughter and find only silence waiting instead." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sound of Titan shifting his weight in the straw. When the Duke finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its usual careful distance. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and the words, though simple, carried a weight of genuine understanding that surprised her. "As I am sorry for yours," Elena replied. For a moment, something passed between them that neither seemed entirely ready to name. A quiet recognition of shared pain, of two people who had each learned to build careful walls around the parts of themselves too fragile to expose to the world. The Duke cleared his throat and stepped back, the familiar composure returning to his posture as though he had realized, all at once, how much he had allowed himself to reveal. "You should not stay too late in the stables alone," he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. "The nights grow cold this time of year." "I do not mind the cold, Your Grace," Elena said, though she offered him a small, understanding smile, recognizing the retreat for what it was. "But I will take your advice under consideration." He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the manor, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. Elena watched him go, her chest tight with something she could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to sympathy tangled with a growing, unwelcome fondness she had not expected to find at Ormecliff. She turned back to Titan, resting her hand once more against his warm neck. "We are a strange pair to be healing him, are we not?" she murmured to the horse, a frightened stallion, and a Duke who has forgotten how to hope. Titan huffed softly, as though in quiet agreement, and Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile, before gathering her things and finally making her way back toward the servants' quarters, unaware that behind a darkened window in the manor, sharp eyes had watched the entire exchange with growing, calculated interest. The letter arrived with the morning post, sealed in plain paper, and by the time Elena reached the breakfast table in the servants' hall, the entire household already seemed to know something was wrong. Margaret's face had gone pale, her hands twisting a dish towel with more force than the task required. Two of the younger maids whispered near the pantry door, falling silent the moment Elena approached. "What has happened?" Elena asked, setting down her cup without drinking from it. "It is not my place to say," Margaret murmured, though her eyes flicked toward the manor's east wing, toward the Duke's private study, where raised voices could be heard even through the thick oak doors. Elena did not wait for permission. She crossed the yard quickly, her heart tightening with an unease she could not fully explain, and found herself standing just outside the study, close enough to hear fragments of the conversation within. "The debts your brother left behind cannot simply be ignored, Alexander," a man's voice said, smooth and practiced, the kind of voice used to getting its way through careful persuasion rather than open demand. "The estate's finances are far more fragile than you allow yourself to admit." "I am well aware of the estate's finances, Gerald," the Duke's voice replied, tight with barely restrained frustration. "You need not remind me of my own responsibilities. And yet you spend your mornings watching a stable girl train a horse instead of reviewing the ledgers I have prepared for you," Gerald said, his tone sharpening. "Perhaps if you focused less on distractions and more on the estate's true needs, we would not be having this conversation at all." Elena's stomach twisted at the word distraction, understanding immediately who Gerald meant, though she forced herself to remain still, to listen rather than react. "Titan is not a distraction," the Duke said, "and Miss Whitmore has done more for this estate's stables in 1 week than any hired trainer managed in months. Miss Whitmore is a servant with no proper references, who appeared at our gates the very morning that horse nearly killed another man," Gerald said. "Forgive me if I do not share your sudden confidence in her abilities, or in her intentions. Her intentions are not your concern. Everything at Ormecliff is my concern, cousin, until you produce an heir to secure this estate properly," Gerald said, his voice dropping into something colder, more deliberate. "Your brother's death left this family vulnerable. I would rather not see further foolishness compound that vulnerability." A heavy silence followed, thick enough that Elena could almost feel it pressing against the study door. When the Duke finally spoke again, his voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You forget yourself, Gerald. This is still my estate to manage, and my decisions to make." "Of course," Gerald said, though the smoothness had returned to his tone, masking whatever calculation lay beneath it. "I only wish to see the Ormecliff name protected, as any loyal family member would." Elena stepped back from the door before either man could discover her standing there, her thoughts racing as she made her way back toward the stables, her earlier appetite for breakfast entirely forgotten. She had sensed, from her very first days at Ormecliff, that not everyone within the manor's walls welcomed the changes taking place in the stable yard. Now she understood, with unsettling clarity, exactly who opposed them and why. She found Titan waiting for her, ears pricked forward at the sound of her familiar footsteps, and for a moment, the simple comfort of the horse's steady presence helped quiet the unease still churning inside her. "You do not care about ledgers or inheritances, do you?" she murmured, resting her forehead briefly against his warm neck. "You only care about trust and safety, and knowing the hands that touch you mean no harm." If only every complicated matter at Ormecliff could be resolved so simply. By mid-morning, the Duke appeared at the stable, his expression carefully composed, though Elena could see the tension still lingering in the set of his shoulders. He watched in silence as she worked with Titan, guiding the stallion through slow, careful circles in the paddock, testing his response to the weight of the saddle, now fully secured upon his back. "You seem troubled today, Your Grace," Elena said finally, unable to ignore the heaviness hanging over him. "Family matters," he said simply, offering nothing further, though the tightness around his eyes suggested the conversation with his cousin still weighed on him. "Your cousin does not approve of Titan's training," Elena said carefully, watching for his reaction. The Duke's gaze sharpened. "You overheard our conversation." "I did not mean to," Elena admitted, deciding honesty served her better than pretense. "But I could not help hearing enough to understand his concerns extend beyond the horse." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, watching Titan circle calmly at the end of the lead line, a sight that would have seemed impossible only a week earlier. "Gerald has never approved of much I have done since my brother's passing," he said finally. "He believes grief has made me careless with the estate's future." "And has it?" Elena asked, the question gentle rather than accusatory. "I do not know anymore," the Duke admitted, a rare vulnerability slipping into his voice. Some days I believe I am simply surviving. Other days, lately, I begin to wonder if perhaps I am beginning to live again. Elena's chest tightened at the quiet admission, though she kept her focus steady on the horse before them, giving him the space to speak without the pressure of her full attention. There is nothing careless about allowing yourself to live again, Your Grace. Gerald would disagree, the Duke said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. He believes distraction from duty is the first step toward ruin. Perhaps your cousin mistakes healing for distraction, Elena said. They are not always the same thing. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes. You continue to speak with a confidence unusual for someone in your position, Miss Whitmore. Forgive me if I have overstepped, Elena said, though she did not lower her gaze. I did not ask you to apologize, he said quietly. I find, more and more, that I prefer your honesty to the careful silence everyone else offers me. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in Elena's chest at his words, a feeling she quickly pushed aside, reminding herself of the careful distance that must remain between a duke and a woman with no name, no fortune, and no proper place within his world beyond the walls of his stable. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and both turned to find Gerald himself standing at the edge of the paddock, his sharp eyes moving between the Duke and Elena with open, calculating interest. Forgive the intrusion, Gerald said smoothly, though his tone suggested no genuine apology behind the words. I only wish to see for myself the remarkable progress everyone in the household has been discussing so enthusiastically. Titan responds well to patience, Elena said carefully, sensing the danger beneath Gerald's pleasant tone. So it would seem, Gerald said, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long before shifting back to the Duke. Though I confess, cousin, I remain curious how a scullery maid came to possess such particular skill with horses. It seems a rather convenient talent to discover on the very morning this estate needed it most. Miss Whitmore's skill speaks for itself, the Duke said, an edge of warning entering his voice. Of course, Gerald said, offering a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. I only hope, for the estate's sake, that her talents extend no further than horse training, and that her presence here brings no complications the family cannot afford. The implication hung heavy in the air, and Elena felt her cheeks warm with indignation, though she held her tongue, understanding that any outburst would only serve to prove whatever unflattering assumptions Gerald had already formed about her character. That will be all, Gerald, the Duke said, his voice cold enough that even his cousin's smooth composure faltered slightly. Gerald inclined his head, offering one final, measuring glance toward Elena, before turning and making his way back toward the manor, his footsteps unhurried despite the clear dismissal he had just received. I apologize for my cousin's behavior, the Duke said once Gerald had disappeared from sight. He has always believed the worst of people until proven otherwise. He is not entirely wrong to be cautious, Elena said quietly. I am a stranger with no references. Exactly as he says. You are the reason my stables no longer echo with screaming, and the reason I have slept through a full night for the first time in longer than I care to admit, the Duke said, his voice firm. That is reason enough for me to trust you, whatever conclusions my cousin chooses to draw. Elena met his gaze, something steady and grateful passing between them, though beneath the warmth of his words, a quiet unease still lingered in her chest. She had seen enough of the world to recognize a man like Gerald Ashworth for what he was, someone whose smooth manners masked sharper intentions, someone unlikely to abandon his suspicions simply because the Duke had dismissed them. As the afternoon wore on and Titan continued his slow, steady progress beneath the autumn sun, Elena could not shake the feeling that Gerald's visit to the paddock had not been mere curiosity at all, but the opening move in a much larger game, one she had unknowingly become a piece of the very morning she stepped between a frightened stallion and a raised rifle. Whatever peace had begun to bloom at Ormecliff, she understood now that it would not go unchallenged for long. That evening, Elena sought out Margaret in the kitchen, hoping the older woman's years of experience within the household might offer some clarity about the man who had so openly questioned her presence at Ormecliff. Gerald Ashworth, Margaret said, lowering her voice even though the kitchen stood empty at that late hour. He arrived not long after the young master's funeral, offering his condolences and his help managing the estate's affairs. Some of us wondered, even then, whether his grief ran quite as deep as he claimed. He seems very concerned with the estate's finances, Elena said carefully. He seems very concerned with becoming the next duke, if you ask me, Margaret said, then glanced quickly toward the doorway, as though fearing the words themselves might carry consequences. Forgive me. That is not something I should say aloud, even in my own kitchen. I will not repeat it, Elena said. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then set down the pot she had been scrubbing, wiping her hands on her apron. The master has no children, no wife, no direct heir beyond himself. If something were to happen to him, without an heir of his own, the title would pass to his nearest male relative. She paused, letting the implication settle. Gerald has made himself very available these past 2 years, always ready with advice, always present at exactly the right moments. Elena's chest tightened at the weight of what Margaret was suggesting, though she said nothing further, understanding that such matters extended far beyond anything she had the right or the standing to interfere with. Still, she could not fully shake the unease that had settled over her since overhearing the conversation in the study that morning. "Does the Duke know his cousin's ambitions run so deep?" Elena asked finally. "The master sees the best in people, even when he should not," Margaret said with a tired sigh. "Grief has made him careful about many things, but not always about the people closest to him." Elena thought of the Duke's guarded eyes, the careful walls he had built around himself since his brother's death, and wondered whether those same walls had left him blind to the quieter dangers gathering within his own household. The following days passed with careful, steady progress in the stable yard, though Elena found herself watching the manor's windows more often than she once had, wary of Gerald's sharp gaze finding her at unexpected moments. Titan continued to improve, growing calmer with each session, allowing Elena to guide him through longer stretches of trotting, his old fear slowly giving way to something closer to trust. The Duke, too, seemed to change in small, quiet ways during this time. He arrived at the stables earlier each morning, stayed later each evening, and though he rarely spoke at length, Elena noticed the way his shoulders eased slightly whenever he watched Titan move calmly beneath the saddle, as though each small victory chipped away, piece by piece, at the grief he had carried for so long. "You have given him something none of us could," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching from the kitchen doorway as the Duke laughed, quiet and unpracticed, at something Elena had said near the paddock fence. "I have not heard that sound in this house for 2 years." Elena said nothing, though warmth spread through her chest at the observation, tangled uncomfortably with the knowledge of how impossible any deeper connection between herself and the Duke would ultimately prove to be. The Duke did not choose a stable girl with no fortune and no family name, however gentle her hands or steady her voice. She reminded herself of this fact often, though the reminder grew harder to believe with each passing day. On the 6th day of her trial, disaster nearly struck again. Elena had just finished saddling Titan for a longer training session when a sudden gust of wind sent a loose shutter banging violently against the stable wall. Titan reared instantly, his old fear resurfacing in a single terrifying instant, his front hooves striking dangerously close to where Elena stood. "Titan, no," she said sharply, though her voice remained steady despite the fear spiking through her own chest. She did not retreat, did not flinch away, but held her ground, her hand raised in the familiar gesture he had come to trust over the past week. The stallion's eyes rolled wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but slowly, agonizingly slowly, he lowered his hooves back to the ground, his sides heaving as the panic began to ebb. "There," Elena murmured, though her own hands trembled now that the immediate danger had passed. "There you are. You are safe. I am here." She had not noticed the Duke sprinting across the yard until he was suddenly beside her, his hand gripping her arm, his eyes scanning her face and body for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with something far beyond simple concern. "I am unharmed," Elena assured him, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. The shudder startled him. It was not his fault. The Duke's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the offending shudder, then back toward Titan, still trembling in the corner of the paddock. "You could have been killed, but I was not," Elena said gently, placing her hand briefly over his, still gripping her arm with more force than he perhaps realized. "Titan needs patience now more than ever, Your Grace. This is not the moment to lose faith in him." The Duke released a slow, unsteady breath, his hand finally loosening its grip, though he did not step back immediately, his eyes still searching hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, for reasons that had nothing to do with the horse's near-panic moments before. "I do not know what I would do," he said quietly, "if something happened to you here, under my care." The words hung between them, heavier and more revealing than either of them had likely intended, and for a moment, neither spoke, the space between them charged with something neither was yet ready to name aloud. "I am not so easily broken, Your Grace," Elena said finally, softening the moment with a small, reassuring smile. "Neither is Titan. We simply need a little more time." The Duke nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he finally stepped back, clearing his throat and reclaiming the careful distance that duty and position demanded of him. "Take the rest of the afternoon to rest. That is not a request, Miss Whitmore." "As you wish," Elena said, though she could not fully hide the small, grateful smile tugging at her lips as she watched him walk away, his earlier fear for her safety lingering in the set of his shoulders, long after he disappeared from view. Unseen by either of them, Gerald Ashworth had watched the entire scene unfold from an upstairs window, his expression unreadable, his mind already turning over the new information with the same cold calculation he applied to every matter concerning the Ormecliff estate. A duke frightened for the safety of a stable girl was no longer merely a distraction, in Gerald's careful reckoning. It was becoming something far more dangerous to the plans he had spent 2 patient years quietly constructing, and dangerous things, in Gerald's experience, required swift and decisive handling before they grew too large to control. Whatever peace had begun to bloom at Ormecliff, he understood now that it would not go unchallenged for long, and he intended to be the one who challenged it. Rain hammered against the stable roof the night everything nearly fell apart. Elena woke to the sound of shouting, distant at first, then growing louder as she pulled on her boots and rushed out into the storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating chaos in the yard, grooms running with lanterns, one of the stable doors hanging open, banging violently against its frame in the wind. "Titan is gone," a groom shouted as she reached the yard, his voice barely audible over the storm. The gate was left open. He bolted toward the east field. Elena's heart dropped. The east field bordered a steep ravine, dangerous even in daylight, and utterly treacherous in a storm this fierce. She did not wait for instructions, grabbing a lantern and a length of rope before running toward the field herself, her nightdress soaked through within seconds. "Elena, wait," the Duke's voice called from behind her, and she turned to see him pulling on his coat as he ran to catch up, his usual composure entirely abandoned in the urgency of the moment. "He will be terrified," Elena said, not slowing her pace, "if he reaches the ravine in this storm." She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. They ran together through the driving rain, lightning illuminating brief, flickering glimpses of the field ahead, until finally, near the very edge of the ravine, they spotted Titan, rearing and panicked, his hooves dangerously close to the crumbling edge of the drop. "Titan!" Elena called, forcing calm into her voice despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Titan, it is Elena. I am here." The stallion's ears swiveled toward her voice, though his eyes remained wild with fear, the storm's fury doing exactly what a lifetime of fear had already taught him to do: run first, and think later. "Stay back," the Duke said sharply, grabbing her arm as she moved closer to the ravine's edge. "It is too dangerous." "He trusts me," Elena said, gently pulling free of his grip. "I have to try." She moved slowly through the rain, her voice low and steady despite the storm raging around them, repeating the same familiar words she had used since her very first morning at Ormecliff. Titan's panic slowly began to ease, his hooves settling more firmly against the muddy ground, as her voice reached through the chaos and found the small, steady part of him that had learned to trust her. "That is it," she murmured, close enough now to reach for the trailing lead rope still attached to his halter. "You are safe. I am here. No harm will come to you." Her fingers had just closed around the rope when the ground beneath Titan's back hooves gave way. The stallion screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the storm, his hindquarters sliding toward the ravine's edge as loose earth crumbled away beneath him. Elena pulled hard on the rope, her own feet slipping in the mud, and for one horrifying moment, she felt herself being dragged forward, toward the same crumbling edge threatening to swallow the panicked horse. "Elena!" the Duke shouted, lunging forward and catching her around the waist just as her footing gave way entirely, hauling her back with desperate strength even as Titan continued to scramble against the collapsing ground. "I cannot let go of the rope," Elena gasped, still gripping the lead line with both hands, her arms straining against the combined weight of her own precarious balance and the horse's panicked struggle. "He will fall." The Duke did not release his hold on her waist, but reached past her instead, grabbing the rope alongside her own hands, adding his strength to hers as together they pulled, inch by desperate inch, against the storm and the mud and the terrified animal fighting for his life at the ravine's crumbling edge. "Titan, come on," the Duke shouted, his voice raw with an emotion Elena had never heard from him before, something between command and desperate plea. "Come on, boy, not like this, not again." Whether it was the familiar authority in his voice or simply the last reserves of the stallion's own strength, Titan found his footing at last, scrambling backward onto solid ground with a final, desperate lunge that sent all three of them tumbling backward into the mud, safely away from the ravine's edge. For a long moment, none of them moved, the rain still pouring down around them, the storm's fury slowly beginning to ease as though it too recognized the danger had passed. "Are you hurt?" the Duke asked, his hands moving to Elena's shoulders, checking her over with barely restrained urgency, his earlier composure entirely shattered. "I am well," Elena said, though her voice trembled with the aftermath of fear. "Titan is alive, because of you," the Duke said, his voice rough. "You could have gone over that edge with him, Elena. You could have died tonight." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title attached, and the intimacy of it struck her even amid the chaos of the storm and the mud and the horse now standing quietly beside them, his sides heaving, his earlier panic replaced by exhausted, grateful stillness. "I would do it again," Elena said simply. "He is not just a horse to me anymore, Your Grace, and I do not believe he is only a horse to you either." The Duke's hands tightened briefly on her shoulders before he pulled her into an embrace so sudden and so fierce that Elena barely had time to register what was happening before she found herself held against his chest, his heart pounding as fast as her own beneath the soaked fabric of his coat. "I have already lost too much," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I could not bear losing you too." Elena did not know how to answer such a confession, standing soaked and trembling in the mud beside a ravine that had nearly claimed both of them. But she did not pull away either, allowing herself, for one brief, fragile moment, to simply be held by a man who had spent 2 years teaching himself not to need anyone at all. By the time they led Titan back toward the stable, the storm had finally broken, the first pale hint of dawn beginning to touch the eastern sky. The rest of the household had gathered in the yard, relief spreading across every face as they saw the stallion return safely, and Elena and the Duke walking beside him, exhausted but unharmed. Margaret rushed forward with blankets, fussing over both of them with the same fierce, maternal concern she had shown Elena since her very first day at Ormecliff. "You will catch your death, the both of you," she scolded, though her eyes shone with unshed tears of relief. From an upstairs window, Gerald Ashworth watched the scene below with narrowed eyes, his earlier suspicions hardening into something far more deliberate. The gate to Titan's stall had not opened itself in the storm, though he alone knew that particular truth. And watching the Duke's unguarded concern for a stable girl he had known for barely a week, Gerald understood, with cold clarity, that his careful plans required far swifter action than he had originally intended. A Duke who had rediscovered hope was a Duke far more difficult to control, and Gerald Ashworth had not spent 2 patient years positioning himself so carefully, only to watch it all unravel because of one stubborn horse and the woman who had somehow tamed him. As dawn fully broke over Ormecliff, casting soft golden light across the exhausted, mud-streaked group gathered in the stable yard, Elena caught the Duke's gaze one final time before they parted to change into dry clothes, and understood, with quiet certainty, that whatever had passed between them beside that ravine could not simply be forgotten once the sun had fully risen. Something had shifted between them in the storm, something neither the mud nor the rain nor the danger that still lingered in the shadows of Ormecliff's manor would be able to wash away. Later that morning, once she had bathed and changed into dry clothes, Elena returned to the stable to check on Titan, finding him calm and settled in his stall, a fresh bandage wrapped carefully around a shallow cut on his foreleg where he had scraped against a rock during the fall. She ran her hand gently along his neck, relief still washing through her at how easily the night could have ended so much worse. "You gave us quite a fright," she murmured, resting her forehead briefly against his warm shoulder. "Both of us." "He is not the only one who frightened me last night," a voice said from the stall door, and Elena turned to find the Duke watching her, dressed now in dry clothes, though the exhaustion of the sleepless night still lingered visibly beneath his eyes. "Your Grace," Elena said, straightening, suddenly uncertain how to navigate the space between them after the intimacy of the storm, after the words he had spoken, and the embrace neither of them had planned. "Alexander," he said quietly. "After last night, I think we are well past the point of such formal distance between us, Elena." The sound of her name from his lips, spoken so plainly, sent warmth spreading through her chest despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Alexander," she repeated softly, testing the shape of it. He stepped further into the stall, close enough now that she could see the genuine, unguarded worry still lingering in his eyes. "I meant what I said last night," he told her. "I do not know what I would have done if you had been lost to that ravine along with him." "I am here," Elena said gently. "We are both here, safe, because you refused to let go of that rope. I refuse to let go of you." he corrected quietly, and the honesty in his voice left little room for either of them to retreat back into the careful distance that had governed their days until now. Elena searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that the words spoken in the chaos of the storm had simply been the product of fear and adrenaline, rather than something deeper and more lasting. She found none. Only quiet, steady certainty, the same certainty she had seen in him the moment he first ordered his men to loosen the rope around Titan's neck, trusting her instincts even against every instinct of caution his position demanded. "I should not feel this way about you," she admitted softly. "You are a duke, and I am a woman with no name worth mentioning, no fortune, nothing to offer beyond steady hands and a way with frightened animals. You have offered this household more than steady hands," Alexander said, closing the remaining distance between them. "You have offered it hope, Elena. You have offered me a reason to walk through these stables without drowning in grief every time I look at that horse. That is worth more to me than any name or fortune could ever be." Elena's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words, at the warmth in his gray eyes that had once seemed so cold and guarded on the morning she first arrived. "Your family will not approve," she said quietly, thinking of Gerald's sharp, calculating gaze, of the careful suspicions he had already begun sowing throughout the household. "My family's approval has never been the measure by which I judge what matters most," Alexander said. "And after last night, I find I care far less than I once did about what my cousin thinks of my choices." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by Titan's soft, contented breathing beside them, as though even the stallion sensed the shift taking place in the quiet stall around him. Elena allowed herself, finally, to lean into the moment rather than retreat from it, resting her hand lightly against Alexander's arm, grounding herself in the solid, steady warmth of his presence after a night that had tested every ounce of courage she possessed. "We should let him rest," she said finally, glancing toward Titan, who had already begun to doze standing in the fresh straw Margaret's staff had laid down that morning. "And you should rest as well," Alexander said, though he made no move to step away from her just yet. "You have given this estate more in 1 week than most give in a lifetime, Elena. Allow yourself, just this once, to be cared for in return." Elena smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that reached fully into her tired eyes for the first time since the previous night's chaos had begun. "Perhaps just this once," she agreed. As they finally stepped out of the stall together, leaving Titan to his well-earned rest, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadowed archway near the tack room, nor the careful, calculating expression that crossed Gerald Ashworth's face as he observed the easy familiarity now settled between the Duke and the woman he had grown increasingly determined to remove from Ormecliff by whatever means proved necessary. Gerald lingered only a moment longer before turning away, his footsteps silent against the stone floor, already composing the next careful move in a plan he no longer intended to delay. He had watched the Duke's grief for 2 years, patient and precise, waiting for the moment weakness might finally open a door worth walking through. He had not accounted for a horse, or a storm, or a woman with steady hands and an even steadier heart. Now that he had seen the truth of it with his own eyes, he understood that patience alone would no longer serve his purpose. Later that evening, as the household finally settled into the quiet rhythm of a day recovering from disaster narrowly avoided, Margaret found Elena in the small room she had been given, staring thoughtfully out the narrow window toward the stable below. "You look like a woman with much on her mind," Margaret said, setting down a cup of warm tea beside her. "I fear I have found something at Ormecliff I was not prepared to find," Elena admitted quietly. "Hope, you mean," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "It has a way of arriving uninvited and leaving just as much of a mark as grief does, in its own fashion." Elena wrapped her hands around the warm cup, thinking of Alexander's steady grip pulling her back from the ravine's edge, of the honesty in his voice when he had spoken her name without title or distance for the first time. Whatever waited ahead for them, whatever schemes Gerald continued to weave in the shadows of the manor, she found she could not bring herself to regret a single moment of the night that had nearly cost them both everything. The storm had passed, but within the quiet walls of the manor, a far more dangerous storm was only just beginning to gather, one that neither Elena nor Alexander yet understood was already circling closer than either of them could imagine. Someone had cut the girth strap nearly through. Elena discovered it only by chance, running her hand along the leather before saddling Titan for their morning ride, feeling the strange, uneven texture beneath her fingers where the strap should have been smooth and whole. She examined it closer under the lantern light, her stomach turning cold as she realized the cut was too clean, too deliberate, to be simple wear. "This was done on purpose," she said aloud. though only Titan stood near enough to hear her. Had she saddled him without noticing, had they ridden out as planned that morning, the strap would have given way at speed, throwing her from his back with no warning at all. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. She found Alexander in his study, poring over ledgers with the tired concentration of a man who had not slept fully since the night of the storm, and set the damaged strap on the desk before him without a word. He looked up, confusion shifting quickly to alarm as he examined the cut leather. "Where did you find this?" "On Titan's saddle, not an hour ago," Elena said. "I nearly did not notice it before we rode out." Alexander's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening with an anger Elena had not seen from him before, not even in the chaos of the storm. "Someone in this household did this deliberately. I do not wish to accuse anyone without proof," Elena said carefully, though her thoughts had already turned toward the sharp-eyed cousin who had watched her with such calculated suspicion since her very first days at Ormecliff. "You do not need to say his name," Alexander said grimly. "I am already thinking it myself." He called for the stablemaster immediately, questioning every groom about who had access to the tack room the previous evening, though the answers offered little clarity. Several staff members had come and gone throughout the day, and the tack room itself remained largely unlocked, accessible to anyone within the household who wished to enter unnoticed. "I want the locks changed by nightfall," Alexander ordered, his voice cold with barely restrained fury. "And I want someone stationed near the stables at all hours until we understand who is responsible for this." Elena watched him pace the length of his study, his earlier composure entirely abandoned in the face of what could easily have been a fatal accident. "Alexander," she said gently, using his given name in an attempt to draw him back from the edge of his anger. "We are both unharmed. That matters more right now than finding blame. It matters that someone in my own household tried to hurt you," he said, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes dark with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I will not simply move past that as though it were nothing, Elena." Before she could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the study door, and Gerald entered without waiting for an invitation, his expression carefully arranged into one of polite concern. "I heard there was some trouble in the stables this morning," Gerald said smoothly, his gaze flicking briefly toward the damaged strap still resting on the desk. "Nothing serious, I hope." "A girth strap was deliberately cut," Alexander said, watching his cousin's face closely for any flicker of reaction. Had Miss Whitmore not discovered it before riding, she could have been seriously injured, or worse. "How troubling," Gerald said, though his voice carried none of the alarm the words themselves suggested. "I do hope you find whoever is responsible for such carelessness among your staff." "It was not carelessness," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet now. "It was deliberate." "Surely you do not suspect one of your own household would do such a thing intentionally," Gerald said, his composure never wavering, though Elena noticed the faint tightening around his eyes, the smallest crack in his otherwise flawless mask. Perhaps Miss Whitmore's own inexperience with proper tack maintenance is simply to blame. The accusation, subtle as it was, struck Elena harder than she expected, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks despite her determination to remain calm. "I have maintained tack since I was a child, Mr. Ashworth. I know the difference between worn leather and a deliberate cut." "Of course," Gerald said, though his tone made clear he did not fully believe her. "I meant no offense, Miss Whitmore. I only wish to ensure my cousin does not act rashly on assumptions that may prove unfounded." "I act on evidence, Gerald," Alexander said sharply, "and the evidence sits directly on this desk." Gerald's gaze lingered on the strap a moment longer before he inclined his head, offering a thin, unreadable smile. "Then I trust you will investigate thoroughly, cousin. I would hate to see false suspicion cast carelessly upon members of this household who have served this family faithfully for years." The implication was clear enough, and Elena understood immediately that Gerald had positioned himself carefully, ready to redirect suspicion toward the household staff, toward anyone but himself, should the investigation begin closing in around him. He excused himself shortly after, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken accusation and unresolved danger. "He did this," Elena said quietly, once Gerald had gone. "I am certain of it, though I cannot yet prove it." "Nor can I," Alexander admitted, frustration evident in every line of his posture. "But I intend to find proof, Elena, before he tries something far worse than a cut strap." Over the following 2 days, tension within Ormecliff's walls grew thick enough to feel in every quiet corner of the manor. Alexander doubled the guard around the stables, questioned every member of staff personally, and reviewed every ledger and correspondence Gerald had touched since his arrival, searching for any thread that might expose the truth behind his cousin's careful, calculated ambitions. Elena, for her part, refused to be frightened away from Titan's side, though she remained more vigilant now, checking every piece of tack twice before use, never leaving the stallion unattended for long. The bond between them had grown strong enough that Titan seemed to sense her unease, staying closer to her side than usual, as though understanding, in his own quiet way, that danger still lingered somewhere within the walls that surrounded them both. On the third night after the discovery of the cut strap, Elena woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and running before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct, her heart hammering as she raced toward the stable, already visible through her window with an ominous orange glow flickering along one wall. "Fire!" she screamed, loud enough to wake half the household, as she sprinted across the yard toward the stable doors, smoke already curling thick and black from beneath the entrance. Titan's terrified screams reached her before she even threw open the doors, and she plunged into the smoke-filled darkness without hesitation, her nightdress pulled up over her mouth and nose, her eyes streaming as she fought her way toward the sound of the panicked stallion. "Elena!" Alexander's voice roared from behind her, and she heard him coming, heard other voices joining him, buckets and shouts and the frantic clang of the estate's fire bell ringing out across the grounds. She found Titan rearing wildly in his stall, flames already licking dangerously close along the wooden partitions separating him from the neighboring stalls, his eyes wide with the same primal terror she had first seen on the morning they met. "Titan, this way," she gasped through the smoke, fumbling with the latch on his stall door, her fingers clumsy with panic and heat. "Please, please, this way." The latch finally gave way, and she grabbed his halter, pulling with every ounce of strength she possessed, guiding the terrified animal through the smoke toward the doors, toward the cool night air waiting beyond the flames. Behind her, she heard other grooms freeing the remaining horses, their combined efforts a chaotic, desperate race against the spreading fire. They burst through the stable doors together, Elena coughing violently, her lungs burning, but Titan safe, terrified but unharmed, beside her. Alexander reached her within seconds, pulling her away from the burning building, his hands shaking as he checked her over for injury, with the same desperate urgency he had shown beside the ravine days before. "I told you to wait for help," he said, his voice raw, torn between relief and fury. "There was no time," Elena managed between coughs. "He would have died, Alexander." Behind them, the stable continued to burn, though the household's combined efforts, buckets passed hand to hand in a desperate chain, gradually began to bring the flames under control before they could spread further. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, exhaustion had settled over every member of the household, faces streaked with soot, hands blistered from the effort. It was Margaret who found the evidence, near dawn, sifting through the charred remains of the stable's storage room. A broken lantern, its oil reservoir emptied deliberately near a pile of dry straw, far from where any legitimate use would have placed it. "This was no accident," she said grimly, showing the shattered lantern to Alexander, whose face went pale with a fury Elena had never witnessed from him before. "Gerald," he said, the name leaving his lips like a curse. He found his cousin in the study less than an hour later, still dressed for bed, feigning surprise at the night's chaos with a performance too smooth, too practiced, to be genuine. "I heard about the fire," Gerald said, rising from his chair. "Thank goodness everyone escaped unharmed." "Where were you tonight, Gerald?" Alexander demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "In my chambers, of course," Gerald said, though something flickered behind his composed expression, the faintest crack in a mask he had worn flawlessly for 2 long years. "Margaret found a broken lantern near where the fire began," Alexander said, stepping closer, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "Its oil had been poured deliberately over dry straw. Care to explain that, cousin?" Gerald's composure finally shattered, his carefully constructed mask slipping to reveal something colder and far more desperate beneath. "You would believe a housekeeper's word over your own family." "I would believe evidence over lies," Alexander said. "The cut strap, the fire. How long have you been trying to remove Elena from this estate, Gerald? Or was it never truly about her at all?" Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous, until finally Gerald's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from his posture as he realized the game he had played so carefully for so long had finally, irrevocably, come undone. "This estate should have been mine," Gerald said quietly, bitterness lacing every word. "Your brother's foolishness, your grief, your inability to move forward, none of it mattered so long as you remained too broken to notice how close I had come to securing everything for myself. And then she arrived, and you began to heal, and everything I had worked toward began slipping away. You endangered lives, Alexander said, his voice shaking now with barely controlled rage. You endangered Elena's life, Gerald. Over ambition. Over what should rightfully have been mine, Gerald snapped, though even he seemed to hear the hollowness of his own justification as the words left his mouth. Alexander said nothing further, simply turning toward the door and calling for the household guards, his expression a mask of cold, controlled fury, as Gerald was led away, his ambitions finally, thoroughly exposed before the entire household he had spent 2 years trying to deceive. Elena, standing in the doorway throughout the confrontation, felt the weight of exhaustion and relief crash over her all at once, as Gerald's footsteps finally faded from the manor's halls. Alexander crossed the room to her immediately, pulling her into his arms without hesitation, without the careful distance that had once governed every moment between them. "It is over," he murmured against her hair, though the tremor still lingering in his voice suggested the fear of the past days had not yet fully released its grip on him. "It is finally over, Elena. We are safe," she whispered back, allowing herself, finally, to believe it. "Titan is safe. We are all safe now." Outside, the first light of dawn began spreading gently across Ormecliff's scarred but standing stable, illuminating a household finally free of the shadow that had lingered so quietly, so dangerously, within its walls for far too long. In the days that followed, the full weight of Gerald's betrayal settled over the household in slow, uncomfortable waves. The local magistrate arrived to take a formal account of events, and Alexander spent long hours closeted away with solicitors, untangling the careful web of debts and manipulations his cousin had woven throughout the estate's finances over the past 2 years. It became clear, piece by piece, that Gerald had been quietly diverting funds meant for tenant repairs and stable improvements, building a private fortune while presenting himself as the estate's most devoted guardian. "I should have seen it sooner," Alexander admitted one evening, sitting beside Elena on a bench near the newly repaired stable, the scent of fresh timber still lingering in the evening air. "I was so consumed by grief that I let him manage far more than I ever should have trusted to anyone outside my own judgment." "Grief has a way of blinding even the most careful men," Elena said gently, resting her hand over his. "You are not responsible for the choices Gerald made, Alexander. You are only responsible for how you choose to move forward now." He turned to look at her, something soft and grateful passing across his features in the fading evening light. "You have taught me a great deal about moving forward, Elena. More than I think you realize." The staff, too, slowly began to heal from the shock of discovering how close danger had come to their own doorstep. Margaret took to checking the stable locks herself each night, a habit born of caution rather than fear, while the grooms worked together with renewed purpose, rebuilding the damaged section of the stable with careful, steady hands. Titan, remarkably, showed no lasting fear from the fire, settling into his newly repaired stall with the same calm trust he had slowly built over the preceding weeks. Elena spent extra time with him each day regardless, understanding that trust, once broken and rebuilt, required continued tending to remain strong, much like the fragile, growing bond between herself and the man who had once seemed as guarded and unreachable as the stallion himself. "He watches for you now," Alexander observed one afternoon, standing beside her at the paddock fence, as Titan trotted eagerly toward them at the sound of her approaching footsteps. "The way he used to watch for danger, he now watches for you instead. Perhaps he has simply learned that not everyone who enters his world means to bring him harm," Elena said, reaching out to stroke the stallion's velvet nose as he nuzzled affectionately against her palm. "I understand that lesson better than I once did myself," Alexander said quietly, and something in his tone made Elena turn to look at him fully, catching the unmistakable warmth in his gray eyes as he watched her. Word of Gerald's exposed treachery spread quickly through the surrounding county, and with it, whispers of the stable girl who had not only tamed the estate's most dangerous horse, but had also, through her quiet courage, helped expose a scheme that might have otherwise cost the Duke everything he held dear. Elena found herself the subject of curious glances whenever she ventured beyond Ormecliff's gates, though she paid little attention to the gossip, focused instead on the slow, steady healing taking place within the estate's walls, both for Titan and for the man who had begun, tentatively, to let her fully into his life. One evening, as the last golden light of sunset spilled across the paddock, Alexander found her exactly where he always seemed to find her now, standing beside Titan, her hand resting gently against his neck as the stallion dozed contentedly in the cooling evening air. "I have spoken with the solicitors," Alexander said, coming to stand beside her. "Gerald's claim to any future inheritance has been formally severed. He will face the full consequences the law demands for what he has done." "I am glad," Elena said simply, "though I confess, I find myself thinking less of Gerald these days, and more of what comes next for Ormecliff. As do I, Alexander said, and something in the careful, deliberate way he said it made her heart quicken with anticipation. Elena woke before dawn, the way she had every morning since arriving at Ormecliff, though this particular morning carried a strange, unfamiliar stillness she could not quite name. The estate had settled, in the weeks since Gerald's exposure and departure, into a rhythm gentler than any she had known there before. The stable stood fully repaired, its fresh timber walls a quiet testament to how far the household had come since the night flames had nearly taken everything. Titan greeted each morning now with calm curiosity rather than fear, and the household staff moved through their days with a lightness that had been entirely absent during Elena's first weeks at the estate. Yet something in the air that morning felt different, charged with an anticipation she could not fully explain. She found Alexander already waiting near the paddock fence when she arrived, dressed more formally than his usual morning attire, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had rarely seen from him, not even during the chaos of the storm or the fire. "You are awake early," Elena said, approaching with a curious smile. "I could not sleep," Alexander admitted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so uncharacteristically flustered that Elena's curiosity deepened further. "I have something I wish to discuss with you, Elena. Something I have wanted to say for some time now, though I confess I have struggled to find the proper words." Titan trotted over to the fence, nosing gently at Elena's shoulder as though sensing the significance of the moment unfolding around him, and she reached up absently to stroke his neck, giving Alexander the space to gather his thoughts. "When you first arrived at Ormecliff," he began, "I was a man who had convinced himself that grief was simply the price of loving anyone or anything too deeply. I had built walls around myself so carefully that I no longer noticed how thoroughly they had isolated me from everyone around me, from my own household, from my own life." "Alexander, please," he said gently, "let me finish. I have rehearsed this more times than I care to admit, and I fear if I stop now, I may lose my courage entirely." Elena fell silent, watching him with growing warmth as he continued, his gray eyes steady on hers despite the vulnerability evident in every word. "You walked into my stable yard on the very morning I had resolved to end Titan's suffering, certain nothing more could be done for a horse so thoroughly broken by grief and fear," Alexander said. "And in the span of a single week, you proved me entirely wrong, not only about him, but about myself as well. You did not simply tame a frightened stallion, Elena. You reminded an entire household, and its stubborn, grieving duke, what it felt like to hope again." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Elena's eyes as she listened. The weight of the past weeks, the storm, the fire, the fear and the healing, settling into something far more tender than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this very moment. "I have watched you approach every fear in this household with nothing but patience and courage," Alexander continued, reaching for her hand. "The same fear that gripped Titan, the same grief that gripped me, the same danger that Gerald brought into our lives. You never once retreated from any of it, not even when retreating would have been the safer, easier choice." He knelt then, slowly, deliberately, and Elena's breath caught as understanding dawned fully across her. "Elena Whitmore," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "You came to Ormecliff seeking nothing more than simple, honest work, and you have given this estate, and given me, far more than I ever could have imagined possible. I do not offer you a title or a fortune because I believe you need either to prove your worth. I offer you my heart, freely and completely, because you have already claimed it, piece by careful piece. Since the very morning you first stepped between me and a rifle I now understand I never truly wished to fire." He reached into his coat, producing a small ring, simple and elegant, catching the early morning light as he held it toward her. "Will you stay at Ormecliff, Elena? Not as a servant, not merely as Titan's trainer, but as my wife, as the woman who taught this entire household how to heal?" Elena's hands trembled as she looked from the ring to Alexander's hopeful, uncertain expression, to Titan watching curiously over the fence beside them, to the repaired stable standing solid and strong in the morning light behind him, a symbol of everything they had rebuilt together from the ashes of grief and danger both. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion, laughter and tears mingling together as the word left her lips. "Yes, Alexander, I will stay. I will stay for as long as you will have me." He rose immediately, sweeping her into his arms, and the kiss that followed carried within it every unspoken word of the weeks they had shared, every fear overcome, every wall carefully dismantled, every quiet moment of trust built slowly between a frightened horse, a grieving duke, and the gentle woman who had refused to give up on either of them. Titan, apparently unwilling to be left out of the moment, nudged insistently between them, drawing a surprised laugh from both Elena and Alexander as they broke apart, resting their foreheads together, while the stallion huffed contentedly beside them, as though he too understood the significance of the promise just made. "It seems he approves," Alexander said, laughter warming his voice in a way Elena had rarely heard during her earliest days at Ormecliff. "He was the one who brought us together after all," Elena said, reaching up to stroke Titan's nose fondly. "It seems only right that he should witness this as well." News of the engagement spread through Ormecliff with a swiftness that rivaled the earlier gossip surrounding Gerald's exposed betrayal, though this time, every whisper carried nothing but genuine joy. Margaret wept openly when she heard, embracing Elena with the same fierce affection she had shown since that very first chaotic morning in the stable yard. "I always knew there was something different about you the moment you walked through our gates," Margaret said, wiping happy tears from her cheeks. "I simply did not expect you would end up healing this entire household quite so thoroughly." The wedding, when it finally came weeks later, took place not within the grand halls of the manor, as many might have expected for a duke's marriage, but in the paddock itself, beneath a canopy of early autumn leaves, with Titan standing proudly nearby, his coat brushed to a gleaming shine for the occasion. Elena had insisted on it, unable to imagine beginning her new life anywhere other than the place where everything between herself and Alexander had first begun. The household staff gathered together, joined by tenants from across the estate who had come to know and respect the quiet strength of the woman who had brought light back into Ormecliff's long-shadowed halls. Margaret stood proudly near the front, dabbing at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, while the grooms who had once watched Elena's arrival with wary uncertainty, now looked on with open admiration and affection. As Alexander slipped a ring onto her finger before the assembled gathering, Elena felt the full weight of everything that had led her to this moment. The loss of her family's farm, the grief of her father's passing, the long, uncertain road that had brought her to a stranger's stable yard on a morning that had once seemed destined for tragedy. None of it had been wasted. Every difficult step had led her here, to this quiet corner of England, to this healing family, to this second chance at love and belonging she had never quite allowed herself to hope for. "I love you," Alexander murmured, just for her, as the ceremony drew to its close. "More than grief, more than fear, more than every wall I once thought I needed to survive. And I love you," Elena replied, "exactly as you are, walls and all, though I confess, I am rather glad you allowed me to help take a few of them down." Titan, standing nearby throughout the entire ceremony with remarkable patience for a horse once considered too dangerous to approach, chose that exact moment to release a loud, satisfied snort, drawing warm laughter from the entire gathered crowd. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Alexander surprised Elena with a gift she had never expected. He had quietly arranged, through careful inquiry and patient negotiation, to purchase back the small farm her family had lost 3 years earlier, the very land where she had first learned to calm frightened animals with nothing more than a steady voice and gentle hands. "I do not need it returned to me," Elena said, overwhelmed, when he first showed her the deed. "My life is here now, at Ormecliff, with you." "I know you do not need it," Alexander said gently. "But I wanted you to have the choice you were never given when your family lost it. Whatever you decide to do with the land, whether you keep it, sell it, or simply visit it now and again, it belongs to you now, free and clear, with no debts weighing upon it." Elena had wept then, unable to fully express the depth of gratitude and love she felt for a man who understood so completely what it meant to lose something precious, and who had worked so quietly to help mend that particular wound alongside all the others they had healed together. In the end, she chose to keep the small farmhouse standing, using the surrounding pastures to raise a handful of gentle mares, a quiet second project alongside her continued work with Titan and the horses of Ormecliff. Margaret, too, found herself swept into the joyful preparations leading up to the wedding, insisting on overseeing every detail from the flowers gathered from the estate's own gardens to the simple, elegant gown Elena had chosen, one that reflected her practical nature far more than the elaborate fashions typically favored by noble brides. "You could have anything you wished for this day," Margaret said, fussing over the gown's final fitting. "Silk from London, jewels from the family vault, anything at all. I only wish for the people I love gathered together, and for Titan standing nearby," Elena said with a soft laugh. "Everything else is simply decoration." The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, the autumn air carrying just enough chill to make the golden sunlight feel especially precious as it spilled across the Ormecliff grounds. Elena stood at her window, watching the final preparations taking shape in the paddock below, grooms carefully arranging simple wooden benches beneath the canopy of turning leaves, while Titan pranced restlessly nearby, seeming to sense the importance of the day ahead. She thought, in that quiet moment before everything changed, of the frightened, grieving young woman who had arrived at Ormecliff's gates weeks earlier, carrying nothing but a small case and a desperate hope for simple, honest work. She had never imagined, not for a single moment, that she would find not only purpose and belonging within those gates, but love as deep and steady as the one now waiting for her beneath the paddock's golden canopy. In the months that followed, Ormecliff flourished under the combined care of its healed duke and his new duchess. Elena continued her work in the stables, training not only Titan but several other horses across the county, whose owners had heard of her remarkable gift, while Alexander threw himself back into managing the estate with renewed purpose and clarity, no longer burdened by the careful deceptions Gerald had woven so patiently throughout his finances and affairs. Titan, now fully trusted and gentle beneath saddle, became something of a legend throughout the surrounding countryside. The once unbreakable stallion tamed not through force or punishment, but through patience, kindness, and the steady, unwavering hands of a woman who had refused to give up on him. On quiet evenings, Elena and Alexander often found themselves back at the paddock fence, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of gold and rose, Titan grazing peacefully nearby, a living reminder of everything they had overcome together. "Do you ever think of that first morning?" Elena asked one such evening, resting her head against Alexander's shoulder as the last light faded gently across the estate. "Every day," Alexander admitted, wrapping his arms securely around her. "I think of how close I came to losing everything before I had even realized what I stood to gain. We found each other exactly when we needed to," Elena said softly. "Sometimes I believe Titan understood that before either of us did." Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, watching as Titan lifted his head briefly to look toward them, ears pricked forward with the same quiet, watchful curiosity he had shown from their very first meeting, before lowering his head once more to graze peacefully in the golden evening light. No one at Ormecliff had believed the fierce, grieving stallion could ever be tamed, just as few had believed their equally guarded, grieving duke could ever fully heal from the losses that had shaped him. Yet standing together now, hand in hand beside the paddock where it had all begun, Elena and Alexander understood, with quiet, certain gratitude, that some of the deepest wounds require nothing more than patience, courage, and someone willing to walk forward gently, refusing to give up, until trust and love could finally take root and bloom. The seasons turned gently over Ormecliff in the years that followed, each one bringing fresh proof of how thoroughly the estate had transformed since that first chaotic morning in the stable yard. Tenants who had once approached the manor with quiet dread, uncertain of the grieving duke's temper, now found themselves welcomed with genuine warmth whenever business or simple friendship brought them to the door. The stables, rebuilt stronger than before, became known throughout the county not merely for Titan's remarkable story, but for the gentle, patient methods Elena continued to teach to every young groom who came seeking work at Ormecliff. Margaret often remarked in her later years that she had never seen a household change so completely in so short a span of time, from a place of silence and careful grief into one filled with laughter, children's footsteps echoing eventually through the halls, and the constant, comforting presence of horses grazing peacefully across the estate's green fields. Gerald's fate, meanwhile, faded slowly from the household's daily thoughts, though never entirely from memory. He served the consequences the law demanded for his actions, and Ormecliff, freed from the quiet poison of his ambition, continued to flourish without the shadow of his schemes hanging over its future. Alexander spoke of him rarely, choosing instead to focus his energy on the family and the future he had built with Elena, rather than dwelling on the past that had so nearly cost him everything. Titan lived out his years at Ormecliff as something between a beloved companion and a quiet legend, greeting each new season with the same calm, steady temperament Elena had so patiently coaxed from beneath his fear. Visitors to the estate often asked to see the famous stallion who had once been considered too dangerous to approach, and Elena never tired of telling his story, of the frightened animal who had simply needed someone willing to look past his fear and see the gentle heart waiting patiently beneath it. The Ormecliff estate, once shadowed by grief and quiet danger, had become instead a place of healing, laughter, and hope, exactly as Elena had unknowingly promised the moment she first stepped forward into a chaotic stable yard, refusing to let fear win, refusing to let go, until every fierce, wounded heart within those walls had finally found its way home. 5 years passed at Ormecliff, and on a bright spring morning, a small girl with dark curls and her father's steady gray eyes toddled across the paddock grass, reaching up with both hands toward a gentle old stallion who lowered his head patiently to meet her. "Careful, Charlotte," Elena called, though she smiled as she watched her daughter fearlessly approach the horse who had once been considered too dangerous for grown men to handle. "Titan is gentle, but you must always let him see your hands first." Charlotte giggled, opening her small palm exactly the way her mother had taught her since she was old enough to walk, and Titan huffed softly, nuzzling her open hand with the same tender patience he showed every member of the family who had grown around him over the years. Alexander watched from the fence. A contentment settled into his features that had once seemed impossible for the guarded, grieving man Elena had first met in that chaotic stable yard. Their son, barely 2 years old, sat perched on his shoulders, small fists gripping his father's collar as he watched his older sister with wide, fascinated eyes. "He never tires of the children," Alexander observed, as Elena joined him at the fence, resting her arms along the worn wood beside his. "He never tired of me either, when I first arrived," Elena said, watching fondly as Charlotte pressed her small forehead briefly against Titan's nose, an unconscious echo of the gesture Elena herself had used on countless mornings during those early, uncertain weeks. "I think he simply understands gentleness better than most creatures, having needed so much of it himself." The estate around them had changed considerably in 5 years, though its heart remained exactly as Elena had first hoped to build it, a place where healing mattered more than pride, where patience was valued over force, and where every frightened creature, whether horse or person, could find safety enough to finally let down its guard. Margaret, now considerably grayer but no less energetic, still ran the household with the same fierce devotion she had shown since Elena's very first chaotic morning at Ormecliff. She doted on Charlotte and her younger brother with the same warmth she had once shown Elena herself, often slipping the children small treats from the kitchen when she believed no one else was watching. "You spoil them terribly," Elena would tease, though she never truly minded, understanding better than most how much love Margaret carried within her, love she had spent years quietly offering to a household that had desperately needed it during its darkest days. The stables themselves had grown considerably under Elena's continued guidance, now home not only to Titan and the estate's working horses, but to a training program Elena had built from careful, patient beginnings, teaching young grooms from across the county the same gentle methods that had once tamed an unbreakable stallion. Families from neighboring estates sent their most difficult, frightened horses to Ormecliff now, trusting in the quiet reputation Elena had built, one patient hour at a time, since that very first morning she had stepped uninvited into danger. "Do you remember," Alexander said one evening, as they walked together through the stable after the children had been put to bed, "how certain I was that first morning that nothing could be done for him?" "I remember," Elena said, smiling as Titan lifted his graying head at the sound of their familiar voices, ambling toward the front of his stall to greet them. "You were quite convinced a rifle was the only sensible solution." "I was wrong about a great many things that morning," Alexander admitted, reaching out to stroke Titan's neck, the same neck he had once refused to approach for fear of what memories the touch might stir. "Wrong about Titan, wrong about grief, wrong about what I believed I deserved after losing my brother." "You were grieving," Elena said gently. "Grief makes us believe strange, untrue things about ourselves." "It also brought you to me," Alexander said, turning to face her fully in the quiet, lantern-lit stable. "Strange as it seems, I find I cannot fully regret the darkest days of my life, knowing they eventually led me here, to this stable, to you, to everything we have built together since." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, watching Titan settle back into his straw with the contented ease of a creature who had long since forgotten the fear that once defined every moment of his existence. Sometimes the deepest grief clears space for the deepest joy, if we are patient enough and brave enough to let it. Word of Ormecliff's remarkable transformation had spread well beyond the boundaries of the county over the years, drawing curious visitors and hopeful horse owners alike, all eager to witness for themselves the estate where a fierce, unbreakable stallion had found gentleness, and where a grieving duke had rediscovered joy. Elena welcomed each visitor with the same quiet patience she had shown Titan from their very first meeting, never boasting of her gift, simply demonstrating it, one calm hour at a time, to anyone willing to learn. She had, in the years since her arrival, trained countless horses considered too dangerous or too damaged to be saved, earning a reputation throughout the region as a woman whose gentle hands could reach places no force or punishment ever could. Yet despite the growing fame surrounding her work, Elena never forgot the humble beginning of her own journey, the small farm she had lost, the father she had buried, the desperate uncertainty that had brought her walking up the drive toward Ormecliff on a morning she had expected to bring nothing more than a simple position in the household kitchens. Instead, that morning had brought her an entire life she had never dared to imagine for herself. A husband who cherished her steady heart, 2 children who filled the once silent halls of Ormecliff with laughter, and a horse whose quiet trust had first opened the door to everything that followed. On warm summer evenings, the family often gathered near the paddock as the sun began its slow descent, Charlotte chasing fireflies through the grass while her younger brother napped contentedly against his mother's shoulder, and Titan grazing peacefully nearby, his once wild spirit settled into the gentle rhythm of a life finally free from fear. "I used to think happiness was something reserved for people who had never truly suffered," Alexander said one such evening, watching his daughter's laughter echo across the darkening field. "I understand now that happiness is not the absence of suffering at all, but simply what remains possible afterward, if we are willing to keep believing in it." Elena reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his as they watched their children play in the fading golden light, Titan's steady, contented breathing carrying softly across the evening air behind them. "We built this together," she said quietly. "Every difficult step of it." "We did," Alexander agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "And I would walk every difficult step again, gladly, knowing it would always lead me here, to this exact moment, with you." As darkness settled fully over Ormecliff that evening, the estate stood quiet and peaceful beneath a sky scattered with early stars, its stables filled with gentle, well-cared-for horses, its halls echoing with the laughter of children who had never known the shadow of grief that once haunted its corridors, and its heart, finally and fully, at rest. The fierce stallion no one believed could ever be tamed had in the end taught an entire household the truest lesson of all, that even the most wounded, frightened hearts could learn to trust again, given enough patience, enough courage, and someone gentle enough to walk forward without ever giving up. Ormecliff had found its peace at last, and within its warm, golden walls, that peace showed no sign of ever fading. Years later, when Charlotte had grown old enough to ask about the story behind the stallion's gentle temperament, Elena would sit with her daughter beneath the same paddock canopy where she and Alexander had first exchanged their vows, and tell the story slowly, patiently, exactly as it had happened. "He was so frightened," Elena would say, watching Charlotte's wide eyes grow wider still with each detail. "Everyone believed he was simply dangerous, simply broken beyond repair. No one thought to ask what he might have been afraid of, or why." "But you asked," Charlotte would say, every time, as though the ending still surprised her no matter how many times she heard it. "I asked," Elena agreed, "and once I understood his fear, I understood that fear and danger are not always the same thing at all. Sometimes the fiercest hearts are only fierce because no one has yet shown them it is safe to be gentle." Charlotte grew into a young woman with her mother's steady hands and her father's quiet determination, spending countless hours in the stables learning every lesson Elena had to offer, determined to carry forward the gift that had first brought healing to Ormecliff so many years before. By the time she was old enough to help train the estate's newest horses herself, the story of Titan's transformation had become something of a local legend throughout the county, retold at gatherings and passed between families whose own troubled horses had eventually found their way to Ormecliff's gentle stables. Alexander, watching his daughter work patiently with a nervous young mare one autumn afternoon, felt the same quiet pride he had first felt watching Elena all those years earlier, a pride rooted not in lineage or title, but in the simple, enduring power of patience and kindness, passed faithfully from one generation to the next. "She has your gift," he said to Elena, as they watched Charlotte's careful, steady work from the paddock fence. "She has her own gift," Elena corrected gently, though warmth filled her voice at the observation. "I only showed her where to look for it." Titan lived a long, contented life at Ormecliff, growing gray around his muzzle in his later years, though his gentle temperament never wavered, even as younger horses eventually took over the more demanding work of the estate. He remained, until his final peaceful years grazing in the paddock's soft grass, a living reminder to everyone at Ormecliff of how far patience and love could carry even the most wounded, frightened heart. Long after that first chaotic morning had faded into distant memory, the lesson Elena had carried with her since childhood remained true, woven now into the very foundation of the family and the household she had built alongside Alexander. Fear, however fierce it appeared, was rarely the whole story of any creature, human or horse alike. Beneath it, given enough patience and enough gentle courage, there was almost always a heart simply waiting to be shown it was finally, truly safe to trust again. And at Ormecliff, that lesson continued to bloom, season after golden season, long after the story of the fierce stallion and the gentle woman who tamed him had passed into the quiet, cherished legend of the estate itself.